Hi, I'm Barry Moore. I'm chair of the Electronic Media and Film Department, and I'm going to make a contribution to EMF 140 today by talking about electronic media. But electronic media, as perhaps you didn't understand it, because I'm not talking about YouTube or video or the internet, I'm talking about something that happened in the 1840s, which is the rise of the telegraph. And it may seem strange that I'm doing something so ancient, since this is electronic media and film, but I think that you'll start to see that some of the issues with the telegraph launched us into the 20th century and actually provided some of the basis for what we now call the internet. So I thought I would look at it. The first thing you should realize if you really look at communication, information, and media history is that you have a person at point A and another person at point B, and they want to get some information. And information in the early days was a nightmare, whether it was smoke signals or whether it was a piece of information that you gave in the 1700s to a horseman who took almost 8 hours to deliver it to someone else 100 miles away. So there was a great dream early in the 1700s and early 1800s, how could information, communication, work faster? Coupled with that was the development of electricity, which was at the time almost a toy or a gimmick. People knew about electricity, people didn't know how it would work, but many inventors thought there was a way that electricity could speed the flow of information. So what we're looking at now is the confluence, if you will, of electricity, information, and networking as the 1840s to the 1890s period presented it to us. The key player in this was an American named Samuel F.B. Morse. Morse was an inventor, Morse was a painter, and like many later computer developers, really just a tinkerer, a person that wanted to fool around and see what he could do with various technologies. Some say that Morse wanted to do the telegraph because his wife passed away. He was out of town. He didn't know that his wife had died. By the time he had gotten the message, his wife was already dead and buried by the time he had returned home. And Morse felt, in some ways, he had to figure a way to make messages come quicker after his own personal crisis. It took Morse over 5 years to invent what would be called the telegraph. And just by way of Greek and translation, a telegraph means a far writer. I like that word, far writer. We are writing far away. Morse was able to invent the telegraph machine, the keypad. He was able, working with other scientists, to invent the batteries that would allow, or not invent the batteries, but take the batteries that were existent and allow them to transmit signals long distance. In the early 1840s, Congress agreed to try a trial run between the telegraph setup in Washington and Baltimore. That was a success. By 1844, the telegraph had linked New York to Washington, Baltimore to Washington, and suddenly, between 1844 and 1860 or 1850, the following happened. The growth of the telegraph, which was telegraph poles, wires, and various stations to get the message, grew astronomically. In 1850, there was over 12,000 miles of telegraph. By 1861, the telegraph had gone transcontinental. So almost a form of early networking had taken place by the time the American Civil War had broken out. The messages that they sent were called telegrams, and they were based on a very simple system called the Morse code that Morse invented, and that was simply da, dit, on, off, on the electrical current. So all messages that were telegrams were sent with a Morse code, where there was a correlation between dot, dit, A, B, C, D, etc. Once that message was received at the station, it would be translated, and a hand messenger would deliver the message to whomever the recipient would be. Early people that did this and got their start were Thomas Edison and Andrew Carnegie. They started in the telegraph, and in fact, Edison's first fortune was based on the ticker tape of stock telegraph. By 1860, the telegraph had gone transatlantic. There was one fouled up attempt, and then by 1860, the telegraph and two lines had crossed the Atlantic from London to Newfoundland. So by the time the Civil War broke out, we were networked nationally, we were networked internationally. And what had been perceived when Samuel Morse started as a toy, as a gimmick, as something without any substance. In fact, to the point that one woman tried to telegraph sauerkraut to her husband who was at a distance, not knowing even what it was used as. So by the time we're looking at the 1860s, we have a network in place. Nationally, internationally, and within Europe, all over Europe. The American model of the telegraph was business-driven. Edison was a capitalist, so was Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse needed a venture capitalist in order to provide the funding for the telegraph. In Europe, the model was much more state-supported. But as you see when you watch electronic media, capitalism and media often go hand in hand, and that's something to look at. The life of the telegraph was really short-lived, but during the period of time, it radically altered, for example, the newspapers. It used to be, before the telegraph, that the newspaper was largely provincial, parochial. It was, if you will, just dealing with local news. Once the telegraph made it possible to transmit national and international news, the focus of the newspaper changed. In fact, that was where syndicates came up, like AP, Reuters, to exploit the information that was coming in literally 24 hours a day across the ocean and across the continents. American business and capitalism changed because of the telegraph. The instantaneousness of messages about stocks, products, distribution meant that business as a practice accelerated. It meant that business suddenly became 24/7 even in the 1800s because it was a constant need to supply and meet demand. War strategy changed. The recent book just came out on Abraham Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln's telegraphs to generals during the Civil War. Lincoln used the telegraph and the telegram to plot strategy. So what we're really saying is, just like the internet, the telegraph networked Americans, Europeans, and the world in the 1860s and 70s. It provided social networking where marriages were proposed, people were code breaking, crimes were committed on the network. It was a revolutionary device and largely monopolized in this country by Western Union, which held about 90% of the control of the stations, the transmitting, and the wires. But all good things come to an end. In the 1870s, Alexander Graham Bell began to improve on what he thought were experiments to improve the telegraph and the telegram. And he experimented with what he called harmonic telegraphy. What he discovered was that sound was being transmitted instead of just the dot and the dits of the telegram. He exploited this, realized that he could now transmit sound over an electric wire, and this sound proved to be the basis of the telephone. 1876, the telephone is here. By 1900, the telephone had overcome the telegraph, and it was the predominant means to communicate. Although things were still left, like Western Union messages, ticker tapes continued, which were a form of telegraphy. But it kind of shows us that we expect one media to persist and live, but often media get consumed by another media. In this case, the telephone was instantaneous. It did not require translators. It did not require messenger people. It was personal, and it was able to communicate the way the telegraph had done previously. I think it's really important with any media, old or new, to look at the effects of that media socially, economically, culturally. And what I'd like to do is just for a second review the impact of the telegraph and try to project forward some of the things that came out of telegraphy and look at next the 21st century. The first thing to look at is communication and information. That the telegraph, just like the internet, just like television, just like radio, attempted to conquer great distances quickly, if not instantaneously. And by and large, the telegraph did that for its own time and space and period until the telephone came along. It is also interesting to look at that each new media often has its own protocol of communication. In this case, with the telegraph, it was Morse code. With the internet, it's HTML. With email, it's ASCII language. But this language persists unique to each medium. So if one thing is communication, information, and distance, and the telegram really started to lay the groundwork for that. The second thing that is so critical to the world we live in now is the network. Now, with the telephone or telegram, the network really was wires on a pole moving through space. Mile after mile had to be laid, but it was a faster form of communication than what existed. For example, if you wanted to get a message out west to California before telegraph wires were laid, you had to put it in a leather pouch, and a rider named worked with the Pony Express to deliver the mail. With the new system, with the wiring, the network took care of that messaging, and the Pony Express went poof. So second thing we learn is that the existence of the network is critical to the mass of any kind of media communication. Another thing that often gets forgotten in networks, and modern networks too, is the role of electricity. This network of the 1800s would not have worked without electricity. Our networks today would fail without electricity. Look at the chaos in New York after 9/11, especially with the amount of hubs, linkages, and networks that were in the World Trade Center. It virtually shut it down. So the existence of a network, which the telegraph laid the groundwork for. Third, something we forget about. To me, one of the most interesting things that goes all the way back is the use of binary language. Binary language had been looked at by Blaise Pascal as early as the 1600s. It has really the foundation of the modern internet and the digital revolution. Basically, 0, 1, 0, 1. Replicated, if you will, by the binary language of the Morse code, which is on, off, dot, dit. So the telegraph laid the foundation for binary language. Next thing we want to look at. The telegraph in this country was a profit-making entity. Invention often starts out as frivolous, gimmick, a toy, but if it catches on, it will need to attract capital in order to lay the groundwork for any growth or any networks or any profitability. And this is something Edison discovered with a venture capitalist named Vail and the support of the United States government. It took a very wealthy individual, Cyrus Field, using his wealth to lay the transatlantic cable. Most modern media may start out in someone's garage, but sooner or later, we're going to have the role of capital, venture capital, in order to make that media successful. Another aspect of modern media is what an old media theorist, Marshall McLuhan, referred to as the global village, meaning that if the world can be interconnected, then we become as small as a village. As far away as we are, as distant as we are, we become like a small village if we are networked properly. What the telegraph showed us was that it was possible that this electric, wire-strewn media could be a social network that reduced the world to a global village. It meant that we had a wired world. It meant that we had a new way of doing business. People were even proposing on the internet to a mate to get married. So that the global village is not something of Web 2.0 or the early internet. The global village really was beginning to exist with the role of the telegraph. Finally, when I look at the telegraph, I also see a message about the rise and fall of media. McLuhan used to refer to it as one media consuming another. In this case, the telephone, with its ability to transmit voice, information quickly without an intermediary or intercessionary language, allowed us to do what the telegraph did before. The internet took film, radio, TV, information, text, and allowed all of that to coexist in one wired network. So when I look at media, I look at the rise and fall of media. I look at film as a kind of, as one of my colleagues refers to it, as a legacy format, as it slowly gets subsumed by digital video, as it gets subsumed by the internet, by YouTube. So as I look at the telegraph and the whole history of it, I'm also looking at the history of modern media, the rise and fall of networks and faster ways to communicate. Many of you are probably taking EMF 140, Intro to Electronic Media and Film, as a general education requirement. And some of you are probably also taking it as your first course as a pre-electronic media and film major. And I thought I would give you some introduction to EMF, the department, and I'm actually going to do it back-endedly. I'm not going to actually tell you about our faculty, who I think are excellent, or our curriculum, which I think is very good and underappreciated in this region, but I'm going to tell you about what happens after college and what EMF is when you're a graduate. The first thing you should understand is that it is not a given because you major in something in college that you're going to find work after college. EMF is not like nursing or engineering or even pre-law or pre-medicine, where when you come out, you're either ready for advanced postgraduate study or you come out a nurse or an engineer and you find employment. When you come out with a broad-based education in electronic media, you're really back in some ways to square one about what are your abilities and how will you market them when you go out in the world. If you look at electronic media and film, if you look at the web, if you look at interactive media, all the various employment opportunities that are available to you when you graduate, you're looking at some of the most competitive fields that are available. No one is going to hire you just because you've graduated from Towson. You have to offer the world something, and you have to have certain qualities. And I thought I would go over those. As I wander around, I have to tell you a story that happened a couple weeks ago. I went into a local record and tape traders, and behind the counter was a former graduate of EMF. And he said, "Hey, Dr. Moore, here I am." I went next door to a bookstore, a used bookstore, to sell a couple books back. And lo and behold, the books buyer said, "Hey, Dr. Moore, I'm an EMF grad. I can go out to Best Buy and see an EMF grad. I can go across the street and see my neighbor who's an EMF grad and who is installing satellite dishes now." None of these jobs are necessarily insignificant, but if you believe that EMF should lead to working in film, video, digital media, interactive media, or the web, then your ambition has to keep pace with that. You cannot assume that because you graduate in EMF that the world owes you a living or even knows you exist. In general, you're entering the world of either information or entertainment or a combination called infotainment. It is your job to network. It is your job to contact employers. It is your job to get 100 rejections before you find employment in this field. If you do find employment, you'll realize that you made the victory, no one else. And while we can post jobs, these are not often the jobs that appear in the Sunday Sun, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Village Voice, or even the Los Angeles Times. You must seek these out. You have to find them. And you find them by internships and networking with people. You find it by making blind calls, by researching positions. You find it by working hard while you're in school to generate a demo reel, a portfolio of your best work, whether it be in video or film or script writing or an audio tape or an audio mix or a web design or an animation. You must show an employer what you can give them. They are not going to hire you because you took EMF 405, EMF 377, etc. I'm amazed by students who actually do their resumes and list the courses they took. If the courses didn't lead to your portfolio, it's of no value. This is not to say that the courses you take are not important, but if you're going to keep your eye on the future, what employers are looking at is what you can do for them, not what they can do for you. If you keep your focus on trying to do quality, professional or pre-professional work that would lead to portfolio, at least you have something to give them. And with so many electronic resume services now, you can virtually put your video, your script online, have someone read it, and you multiply your chances of being employed. You must network to find employment. Another thing that amazes me is the modern media world is worldwide. My son, a few years ago, worked on a Chucky film, Bride of Chucky and all of that, not in this country, but in Romania. How many of you would go to Romania to make a film? Yet, many films have been done in Romania. Who would go there, though? Let's take another example. Students often say, well, what's available in Baltimore and Washington? And I say, well, sometimes you got to look at this whole problem nationally and look at a possible geographic move. Where would you go? Well, the obvious entertainment center is Los Angeles. In second place is New York. And they both have different cultures, different media that are predominant, and you've got to research it to know which one is which and where you should go. But there's also little-known areas. Austin, Texas is a hotbed of music, audio, and film now. Vancouver, Canada is a hotbed of film, as is Toronto. Orlando, Florida is good for video, entertainment, and film. You could go to Hunt Valley if you were interested in video games and electronic games. That is known as Silicon Valley East. It is where many electronic games are done. But you must seek the markets. You must seek the geography that matches your skill set. So, you must be able to network. You've got to be able to communicate. You've got to be able to take no for an answer. And you've got to look at different locales in order to market your skills. The amazing thing is, if you're willing to make that move to, let's say, Los Angeles, you often find that you can work anywhere once you've established your reputation. We have a man that applied for a position with us who was a writer-producer in Los Angeles. He's now living in Baltimore, and the work is coming to him. One of my former students, who's now a director, writer, a director camera person, is now living in Baltimore, and he's asked to go on shoots for ESPN, Discovery Channel, everywhere in the United States. So sometimes the geographic move is temporary, and once you have a reputation, you're only the internet away from any other geographic locale. But a person is not going to get a job because they graduated from EMF. No one owes you a job because of that. If you haven't laid the groundwork as early as your junior year to begin to look for internships, to begin to network, to begin to look at other areas, locales, whether national or international, for hiring, to begin to narrow down who you are, not just to say, I want to do film. But what does that mean? Do you want to do storyboards? Do you want to direct? Do you want to write? You want to be an assistant behind the scenes? You've got to begin to narrow down what your career choices are. And hopefully, if you do all that, then you end up getting a reputation, getting employment, and finding a niche in this wonderful new world of information, entertainment, and the internet.